So today we're going to be starting an anemone watercolor and ink painting. So what we're going to do first is on a separate piece of paper, not watercolor paper, I'm going to be drawing my anemones. I hope I'm saying that right. It says it's pronounced anemone. And these kind of flowers are really fun to paint just because they come in lots of different colors. So you'll actually see kind of a gothic anemone flower where it's actually like black with a red center. There's some that are white with a purple center. So they're really fun flowers. So we're gonna be drawing this lightly onto copy paper, and then I'm gonna show y'all how to transfer it to our watercolor paper. And the reason why we do that is just because it's tricky to erase, off watercolor paper without using a really harsh eraser sometimes. And sometimes it doesn't all come off, depending how hard you press. And watercolor paper is pretty sturdy, but if you erase too many times on it, then it doesn't take enough layers of the watercolor. A lot of times it'll start resisting it. So that's why a lot of times I'll draw on a separate piece of paper unless it's something really simple. Now with flowers in general, I tend to start by drawing the radius of the flower. So kind of just, the overall kind of shape. So how this part, is fairly a circle. This part is more like an oval, and then this one is a very slender oval. So I would start with those shapes just to kind of visualize where they're gonna be on my painting before I even start thinking about petals. So I'm gonna put this first flower about right here, and then I'm gonna overlap this flower just a little bit more slender. This one goes at a slight angle. And then this flower actually gets cut off. Now, before I start drawing it, I want to decide if I want to have it cut off and go all the way to the edge of the tape, or you can just kind of finish off the drawing like I did on this one. So let's say I wanted to finish drawing it, then I'd probably move it down a little bit, so then it's more like right there. Okay, so that'll be our first step. And then I'll lightly draw circles for the centers, and then I'll start talking about the petals. So now that I have these shapes established, what I'm going to start doing next is, before I get too detailed with drawing each petal individually, a lot of times what I'll do is just kind of think about how much space each petal is taking up. So especially when drawing flowers, it's good to look at what's called your negative space. So that's the space in between petals. So if I look at that, that helps me to see, how close those petals are gonna be. And looking at kind of that space. So you could also count the petals. That makes it really nice and helpful. Going like that. And it's gonna look like a little elementary school daisy. Yeah. And then once I have that, then I'll go back and start making it a little more detailed. Now, if you're not sure what angle a petal's gonna be at, you can always hold your pencil up against that and it'll help you to measure the angle. So I'll say, okay, this one's kind of tilting that way. The tip is going this way, and start that way. So, and I'll keep doing that for every single petal. So now that I have finished my sketch, I'm going to show y'all how to transfer. So since this is just on regular copy paper, you just turn to the back. Okay, this is the back of your drawing. And then you would use a 6B pencil because it's very dark. You could also use 5B or 4B or something like that. Those are also pretty dark. It's just 6B is normally your darkest one. They make them even up to like 10B though. And basically, yeah. Oh. And basically you can just use the side of the tip and scribble all over the back of your drawing. And then basically wherever you draw, it's going to put it onto your watercolor paper. Now I'd probably recommend when you put your paper onto the watercolor paper to put a little piece of tape to hold it still while you're tracing, so you don't end up with like a million flowers because it shifted slightly while you were drawing on it. So, and then after it transfers, it should be visible, but it's going to be pretty light. And that's what we want since we're going to be coming back and creating more lines using our ink pens, rather than when you transfer like for an acrylic or an oil painting, then normally you want really dark lines and you use transfer paper. So our next step is going to be inking our flowers. Now, when you outline a subject, you want to think about what kind of line you want. Like if it was something really smooth, then I would probably want more of a consistent line. And also if you want to have like a really bold dark line, or if you want more subtle lines. Now, typically for organic things like flowers and birds, I tend to like to do more lighter lines, just because you can always go back and add more ink, but you can't really undo. So I'm using an 02. So on your pens, you'll see that the numbers coincide to the size of the nib. So like a 005 is like a half. And then a 1 is slightly bigger, 2 is bigger, and then it goes up from there. So I'm using a 2 just because if I use it with a really light hand, it's pretty small. But I would have y'all probably recommend use a 1 or a 005. That's pretty good. So, and the important thing is when you're using your ink pen that you look at where you're going, not where you're coming from. Because you don't want to start inking and then all of a sudden you have a petal going straight through another flower where it's not supposed to. So I normally start off pretty light, and you don't have to have an even line. You can kind of skip a little bit so it's a little more random. So see how I've done that? And then you can also use this opportunity to make it like a little more ruffled. Like that. So that's what we're gonna go ahead and do, is outline everything except for our centers. I'm gonna talk about a little bit how we're going to be outlining those in a minute. So take your time, don't feel rushed, and outline the flower. So once you have the main shape outlined, then for my center, I want to show how, it's kind of fuzzy. So that doesn't necessarily mean I have to put that fuzzy texture on the whole entire thing. Some of that can be painted, but along the outside, what I want to do is flick and do little lines like that. So that has, kind of like little hairs almost. And then to make the center a little bit darker, then I would do some lines diagonally and then crosshatch in the other direction. So then it still feels, kind of fuzzy and liney, but you don't have to do like individual hairs for the whole entire thing. So that's what I would do for the dark part of the center. And then for these little pollinators, then I want to do just kind of a shape. Now, some of these we can paint in, so you don't necessarily have to outline all of them, but I'm just going to at least draw a few so I have kind of the feel of the center of the flower. All right, and then the last thing we want to do with the inking, because a lot of times with florals, I'll try and keep it very light because you can always add more inking on top of it, is I'll probably just shade. And by shading, I mean mostly just hatching. Hatching is where you're doing individual lines. So like on the stem, like say this is my stem, what I want to do is replicate the direction that the stem is going in and add more lines for a shadow. And then if I need it to be darker, I can just overlap those same lines. Or sometimes if I want it to appear more curved, then I'll do cross hatching like that. So I know it's hard to see sometimes when it's so small, but essentially that's what you want to do just a little bit of, and it's going to react a little bit differently on paper than it does on the watercolor paper, just because it'll drag a bit more. And then on my flower petals, I can just do a little bit of shading on the edges just so they feel a bit more ruffled. I'm not really filling the whole petal. I'm just doing like a few lines and that's about it. And then after that, then we'll work into the watercolor stage. So now that we have our flowers inked, we're gonna go ahead and get started painting them. Now with these kind of anemone flowers, they're kind of a purpley blue. So you could use like a cobalt, or I'm gonna be using phthalo with a little bit of pink to it. So what I'm gonna start with is I'm gonna be taking a little bit of my clean water from here, and then I'm gonna be taking that water and putting it on my palette. And then while my paintbrush is wet, I'm gonna be taking phthalo blue, which since mine are dry, I sometimes have to kind of scrub a little bit just to get all the paint in here. If you're using fresh paint, you just really need to like tiptoe in the paint because watercolor is very concentrated. So then I'm gonna make that nice blue puddle like that. And then I'm gonna wash off my paintbrush. And then I'm gonna grab a little bit of a pink. Now your pinky red could be alizarin, could be rose madder. I'm using quinacradone quinacradone magenta actually. And when I add a little bit of it, it just turns our blue just a little bit more purple. Now if yours turns really purple, that just means you need more red. So I want something a little bit like this. And then if it looks too dark, that just means I need more water. If it looks too blue, then that means you need a little more red. All right, and then I'm gonna have everybody watch first how we're gonna be painting our petals, and then I can always repeat the instructions and whatnot. So for these petals, you can see in this picture how there's some white, mostly near the center, and it slowly gets darker. So if you want something to be lighter in watercolor, that typically means instead of using white paint, you're using more water. So that's why we're gonna be doing these petals wet on wet, where we're going to be wetting our petal where we want it to stay light or white, and then we'll be pulling our blue to that. So I have a number 8 round brush, which works for this size of petal. Now, if your petals are a bit smaller, then, probably go a little smaller, like a 6. Or if you have a giant flower, then I would probably go up a brush size. So, and now that I've been washing my paintbrush, I have a section where I've washed it, and that's my dirty water. And then I have a section in the back that I'm going to attempt to keep as my clean water. So what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna take a little bit of clean water, And if it's too wet, you could always tap it on a paper towel, but I'm doing water, you know, mostly right here. And then with that same brush, I'm gonna grab my blue, go along the edge, and then pull it down. Now, if my blue is really strong, then I'll wash off my paintbrush, squeegee the water a little bit, or use a paper towel. And then I'm going to pull that blue down. So you don't want to touch it too much though, because we hem and haw and touch it and all that, we kind of lose the natural like blossoming of the watercolor. And then what I would want to do next is, I don't want to do a petal right next to this petal. I want to skip a petal and then do the one next to it. So I'll show y'all again. I'm going to do just water where I want it to get lighter, and I'm painting in the direction of the petal. Then I'm going to take my blue, go from here, and then I could just drop it like this and leave it. Sometimes that's kind of pretty, just for a lot of contrast. But if it looks too liney, you know, like you have two sections, then that's when you just drag with your paintbrush. But this is giving me like a soft enough line that I can live with that. So, and don't worry if it goes outside your lines. We're not trying to make a coloring book. You could always edit that with a background or wait for it to dry and then you could lift it. But we're not trying to go for, you know, perfectly inside the lines. It's almost impossible to do that. So we're gonna go ahead and do that with all of our petals. And then after that's dry, then we're gonna come back and start adding shadows. If you need to let your petals dry, and most of them are wet, then what I would go ahead and do is mix up a stem and leaf color, which I could use sap green, which sap green itself is a nice pretty green, but it depends which brand you're using. Every brand is a little different in their formula sometimes. So if yours is really olivey looking, like it has a lot of yellow to it, you may want to add a little bit more blue, versus this one's kind of in between. So what I'm going to do is, with a smaller brush, this is like a 2, I'm just going to go through and do a light layer on my stems and my leaves. And this I'm not doing wet on wet, I'm painting them pretty flat. And I'm just gonna go ahead and do that with all my leaves, all my stems. So now that my petals are dry, what we can start looking at is how to add more depth to them. So especially in petals where, you know, like how this one is on top of this one, then I would want to come back with the same color, but, you know, a little less water. And what I would do is basically almost underlining that petal, and then taking a little bit of water and scumbling it out so that it looks like it's blending into this petal. Now, other areas I would want more depth is, especially if you don't have much inking on the edge of your flower petals. Those are a great way to show more depth, because a lot of times when they get kind of, you know, crispy and folded, they'll have little bits of dark edges. So a lot of times I'll darken over here and then pull it down with a little bit of water. So that just adds another layer to it. Now, as you're adding these shadows, if it looks really different from your flower petals, you may have to kind of you know, do a little chemistry, do a little mixing to try and get back to that color. Mine, it seems like, is kind of laying in really blue, but then it'll dry a little more purple. So I'm fine with that. And then I could also, like on this one, the bottom is very dark. So I could just go in and do a flat layer. And then while it's wet, scumble. And scumbling is basically, I'm just rotating my paintbrush like this. And then if it seems like I'm spreading the blue too far, then I'll wash my paintbrush off and just use a little water to smooth it out. So, but it's okay if it's not perfectly smooth. Like this isn't perfectly smooth, and that actually makes it seem more realistic, you know, because if you look at flower petals, they have a lot of like, okay, here's a smudge of white, here's some blue, you know, you don't want them too flat. So that's what we're gonna do next, is just go through on our petals and look for the most important shadows. Think about what flower petals are overlapping. Those are gonna be the most important. And then next, we're gonna start talking about the center. Another fun thing you can do is once you have the shadows on your flower petals and maybe you want to change the color slightly, you can do what's called glazing. And glazing in watercolor is basically where you're taking a color thinned down with a good amount of water, because you don't want to be repainting everything. You're just trying to change it slightly. So like I've already gone ahead and glazed on this flower with my pink. So I could go ahead and do the same thing with this flower back here. So I'm going to take some pink, and what I'm going to do is just very lightly try and keep it consistent, go over the whole flower. And then where I want it to stay white, I'm going to take my Kleenex and lift. See? So that helps to protect it a little bit. Or maybe I went a little too strong with the pink. You could always tap, you know, on the whole thing and just lighten everything up. So you could also do the opposite with blue. It's just a little trickier with blue because blue is a little bit more staining. So if I wanted to make this flower a bit more blue, I'm glazing with my phthalo blue and then coming back in with that. So, you know, two different ways to do it. And for our centers of the flower, you can see how they're a bit more purple than the rest of the flower. So what I want to do is just add a bit more of that pinky red to my blue. So it's just, you know, slightly blue. And I would do a light layer of that color in your center. And then if needed, if you don't have a lot of inking in the center, then we can always come back and do another layer with a darker purple. But sometimes the inking itself already creates kind of that dimension. So I'm just gonna go ahead and do that light layer of that purple on all those. Those little dots, I would probably just take like your blue and just use a little less water, like the blue and the purple. And you don't necessarily have to fill every single one. So this kind of gets the idea across of the flowers instead of filling the whole thing. Because I found if you do fill the whole thing, then it gets kind of muddy and you can't see a lot of definition on the center. Then the last thing I could do is, if I want a little more dimension to my stems, what I could do is just do another layer of that sap green where I want my stem to be a little darker. So like right underneath the flower. I could also kind of underline some of my leaves a little bit. And then to make them a little more interesting and a little more brown, I could even drop in a little bit of my pinky red into the green while it's wet. And you can see, since those are complementary colors, when they mix, they make kind of a brown, which is really fun. And then, you know, if you want to, you could do a background or you could leave it white. Like this one I did with my class on Tuesday, I was showing them how you could splatter, you know, some of the colors that you have in your flowers, and then you could do like grass, things like that. So either one's kind of fun to do. Sometimes it's pretty just to be like kind of a botanical painting where you just have the flowers, and that's up to you.